electronically, make sure you get that link. And then don't forget, there's also additional sessions happening, both from us and from other offices, from the district and from GBN and from other individuals at GBS. For ours, what we do want you to note is that we are now at a point in the summer where we're repeating a lot of sessions. So if you attended some of our sessions in June and into the first part of July, just keep an eye out for repeats. We don't want you to accidentally sign up for and carve time out of your schedule for something that you've already attended. So just be aware that we're doubling up. So what we really want to focus on for today in terms of formative assessment and feedback and synchronous sessions is thinking about the things that we already know that we do well and that work in the live classroom, and just thinking through how we can use those exact same instructional strategies just in this different context, but with the exact same purpose: to break up instruction. Number one, we know that long periods of direct instruction can be ineffective with kids sometimes. Oftentimes they need it to be broken up to maintain engagement, to maintain their attention, and formative assessment and feedback certainly does that. It also helps you to differentiate within a lesson and between lessons. We know that about formative assessment, you get a sense of how kids are doing, what they're understanding, and then you can pivot or modify your instruction. And then it also, of course, gives students good practice with whatever knowledge, understanding, and skills you're working on. And that's going to be true in the e-learning environment also. It's no different. It's just a question of how you modify what we already know works. So we're going to give you a number of ideas in this presentation, food for thought. But the truth is, we're not going to roll our sleeves up and dig in with great depth into the strategies that we're going through. What we want to give you is a lot of ideas for quick checks for understanding and for deeper checks. But if you see some ideas in this presentation and you want a thinking partner, those of you who work at South, you know we're there for you. North and off-campus teachers, don't forget with the technology tools in particular, there are supports at the district level for you. So make sure that you're reaching out for those additional resources if you see something in this presentation that you want to go deeper on. So as always, we ground our presentations in research, and specifically we rely heavily on John Hattie's research. If you've been to other sessions of ours, you've seen us break down Hattie before. If you haven't, I'll give you a brief explanation and then we'll talk about what his research says about formative assessment. So first of all, John Hattie's an internationally known researcher, and what he does is he's a meta researcher. He takes other people's research, he assesses the quality, and he compiles all of that data to make conclusions. He looks at literally thousands of schools and literally millions of data points about millions of students in order to determine what he calls effect sizes, which in a nutshell just means that he measures the learning outcomes based on different inputs. And he looks at societal issues, he looks at home issues, but then he of course looks deeply at instructional strategies, which is our focus today. And what Hattie says is that a 0.4 on his measurement scale means that 1 year's learning is happening in 1 year's time, and that anything above 0.4 accelerates learning. It's just good for learning when we use particular strategies. So when we look at formative assessment, one thing to have on our radar is just formative evaluation in and of itself increases the rate of learning. You can see there it's above 0.48. So it's good. It's good to use as an instructional strategy with consistency and with fidelity. Another one we can look at is the feedback piece. And we're going to talk about that today. But obviously, when you give formative assessment, you learn how kids are doing. To be able to give them quality feedback increases the learning that much more, all the way up to a 0.7, which is an even higher impact. So as always, in these presentations, we have been talking about the importance of establishing expectations, and with formative assessment and feedback, the different approaches that we're going to talk about. You, of course, want to be attentive to expectations, just like in all other contexts. Don't forget that in in-person school, establishing expectations is important. And in e-learning, it's going to be even more important because it's a brand new context for everyone. Kids are really going to have to be reminded of what you expect from them. And we talk about expectations in three realms: how we want kids to act, how we want them to talk, and the space that we want them to be in. So acting, we just want you to be mindful of what you want your students to be doing, to be thinking about that. In terms of talking, how, where, when, and about what do you want them to talk? And then in terms of the space, that question of video, what limitations and expectations do you want your students to know about in terms of their physical space, background and clothing, etc. And we've heard an indication that the at least South's administration, I'm not sure if this is true of North, Sharon, I can't remember, but chime in, but I think it's true of both buildings, are going to have an expectation that kids do have videos on for e-learning, and that if they have a legitimate reason why they need to opt out, they can go through proper channels to get an exemption from turning on video. But that's a kind of a new development that we've learned about, is that kids are going to have video on. So it's going to be important to be thoughtful about what we expect from them in terms of the space that they're showing themselves in. So formative assessment, of course, is going to get kids talking, and in both, and can be done in both full class discussions and in small group discussions. And they're useful, as we talked about, for quick checks and for getting both public and collective feedback. And at this point, Sharon is going to take over to tell you about some specific strategies.
Thanks, Marshall. Yeah, so in terms of full class discussion and small group discussions, there are times that we use these opportunities for quick checks for formative assessment, and there are pros and cons to that particular approach. For formative assessment, most of our presentation today is going to focus on the pieces of discussion, the assessment and the feedback part, but we are going to touch on how you can do some of this in just a moment with the full class as well. But if you want to really dig into synchronous discussions and planning those in detail, we do have one more session on that on August 13th that's going to focus on synchronous classroom discussion. So feel free to sign up for that if you haven't seen that already as well. So just following up on what Marshall laid out before, we're going to use the Zoom chat in just a minute. So we decided we would show you a sample of what your expectations might be for a chat in your class. So these are the expectations for us, for our group today, which are to answer the questions when we ask them. We are going to ask for everybody to answer a question in the chat in a couple of minutes. Of course, as we already laid out, raise your hand like you would in class. That's one way you can use the chat as well. Don't feel the need to read everything others are writing in the chat. For some students, that can be quite overwhelming. So if I'm using it as a tool for formative assessment in my classroom, I might let students off the hook from having to read all of those if I felt that it was going to be overwhelming for them. I might make a different choice as well on that, but for this one, we're going to say don't feel the need, if you don't like to do it, to watch everything, to read everything. Don't use it for side conversations or topics not relevant to our class. That would be something I would set up in my classroom. Sorry, I keep hitting this, trying to move my Zoom window so I can read the screen here. Don't interrupt me. I mean, do interrupt me if you see something in the chat that needs my attention. Marshall had talked about that earlier. And then for us here, in terms of space, there is no real space considerations. We might have already laid that out when we set up what we wanted the kids' background to be of something, and that would be the same as all the other expectations for when we're on Zoom. So what are the pros and cons of using the Zoom chat as a piece of your formative assessment in a synchronous session? It's a really quick and easy way to get all students involved and thinking. So I can ask a question and I can ask everybody to respond. I can also use it and then take a quick look at where they are in their responses. I can also use it just to encourage a smaller group. So maybe I say, anyone who's interested, respond to this. And then I can take a quick poll in my head of like, well, who's interested? How many kids are interested? Oh, nobody's interested. I can just get some quick feedback on that. It can enhance the class discussion for some. So even though I'm using it for a formative check, some kids, like we said before, really love to dig in and see everybody's answers, and that keeps them kind of engaged. And it encourages questions. Maybe a student would see something in there that they want to ask a question about. The cons are it can be difficult to follow. So right now, like when we've been doing these presentations, when I'm talking, either Marshall or Matt is monitoring the chat. Like I can't monitor the chat, answer questions, and present and do all of that at once. So we can get better at it. And if I'm actually doing a formative assessment, there would be a pause in my talking, so then I could watch the chat. But it can be a lot for the teacher to manage. And it can be distracting for some students. But then you can use those results to just see the wide variety of views in the class, engage potential volunteers quickly. So I might use an answer that somebody said to launch another discussion. And I can use the information I gathered quickly to break up into smaller discussions. So let's just try one. So I'm gonna pose a question in a moment, and then we would like everyone to post something, an answer to the question in the chat, and just for your own sense of how it feels as the student, see if you're one of those people that you kind of like to chat and see all the answers flying through, or you're like, oh my gosh, this would be overwhelming to me if I were, as the student. So here's our question. What's your favorite go-to formative assessment in the classroom? So just take a moment to answer that. Your favorite go-to formative assessment. So as you can see too, we can see the chat starting to slow down a little bit. Answers are coming in. And if you look, you can see quite a few things that are repeats. Kahoot's in there quite a bit. Google Forms in there quite a bit. Whiteboards are in there. So the way I could use this now if I were in class, I could send all of you, we're not going to do it today, we would do this in the other session on synchronous discussions just to see how it works, but I could send everyone to breakout rooms. I could do it randomly still. And I could ask you then to say, okay, you have your favorite go-to formative assessment identified. How are you going to adapt that to the e-learning environment? And then you and your group could then launch a stronger discussion about that change for you. If I had a smaller group, it would be hard in this group, but depending on where we were in the course, we could take a short break, even just 1 or 2 minutes. I could then group you by what your answers were. So if I had 20 or 25 people and there weren't, lots and lots of different kinds of answers, I could put all the Google Form people together, all the Kahoot people together, and then launch a discussion in the smaller groups that way. But it's just a way to get a really quick check on something for what you could use to launch other parts of your discussion. So next, we're going to move into the Zoom poll, and Marshall's gonna take over for a minute again and talk about Zoom polls.
So thinking about Zoom polls, really quickly, starting with just the pros and the cons. Just like the chat, one thing that's really nice about it is that it's embedded in Zoom itself, so you don't have to worry about any external technology, and you can prepare the question or questions that you want to poll kids about ahead of time. And as we've referred to, we're not going to really have time today to show you the nuts and bolts of how you do that. But it's pretty intuitive. It's pretty user friendly to set up a poll ahead of time. And then, of course, a poll gives you immediate big picture data about your class, which can be really useful if you're trying to get a sense of what they know or how they're feeling about the learning of a particular lesson. Now, the downside is that the individual data is not really immediate. Now, you can get it in kind of the backroom space of your Zoom setup, but it's not immediately available. So you're not going to see what every kid necessarily answers in an easy way. And generally, because the polls are going to be using multiple choice questions, it's only going to get at the surface. So it doesn't really give kids an opportunity to elaborate on their learning. So it's not a great tool for assessing quick, deep understanding. It's more about surface understanding. So some of the things that you can use the results for is certainly the data can show you if the entire class needs something reviewed, if a lot of kids get something wrong. It can show you if a certain portion of the class needs some interventions. And then, of course, as a result of either of those results, it can create an opportunity for some scaffolding activities. So just being thoughtful about the kids who do need support, what can you do to give them that support? So what we're going to do now is take a look at one. You're going to, of course, experience it from the student side. And Matt, I'm going to ask if you can push out the prepared poll. There we go. So go ahead and give your best answer to the question, how are you feeling overall at this point about your competency as a teacher using Zoom? And once you've answered, we'll see those results trickling in. And actually, Matt, since you're hosting, you'll be able to see the results and I won't. But if I were the teacher, I'd be able to see the results in real time.
I think, Marshall, we're seeing them in real time.
Oh, you are? Okay. On my phone, I'm not. So what's, Sharon, can you tell me what's the top answer we're seeing?
So the top answer is, I feel somewhat confident, but no, I have more to learn and practice, with 58% of the people.
Okay, so that's a great example. If I were teaching this class to students, of course, I could take that data and follow up, right? So I have that percentage. It doesn't necessarily tell me who to target interventions towards, but I know now that I do need to follow up because not everybody is feeling 100% level of understanding. And so maybe in the asynchronous session or the next synchronous session, I now know that I have additional work to do. So we are going to now move into some additional tools, and Sharon is going to take you to the next one.
Yes, Marshall, just before, can maybe someone could unmute. Can the rest of you see this poll? Because it looks like I'm seeing it from, yeah, Joe is shaking his head no. So
no, I think there's a button, whoever's controlling it, there should be a button that says show result.
Yeah, now do you see it?
There we go.
Now we see
But it's really interesting because I'm not the host right now. I guess it's because I'm logged into GBS Instructional Coaches. Matt Berkey, are you also seeing it in the live form, or were you? Not sure what happened. But so the teacher would see the live version happening. For some reason, I could see that. And then the students would not. And then when you were ready, you could show them the results.
Sharon, this is Hong. I'm able to see it. There is a polling button on the bottom of my computer on the screen. So it's available. So I click it, I see the numbers.
Okay, thank you. So other people could try that.
See, but now that it's closed, that button just disappeared. So I think that was only available while it was
open.
Yes, I can't see it anymore. It's closed.
I just closed it, that's why.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's some interesting things you can do with the poll, and as you can see, it takes a little practice. But with you, as the teacher of a course, you would be the only host. So it would be only you seeing everything. Here we have multiple people working on it. So That's why we're all seeing different things. All right, so somebody is writing on our screen. I'm not sure if I'm writing on the screen, but thank you. So other quick in-person quick checks. There's several built into Zoom that you could use. So I did see when we did the chat and you put your favorite go-to formative assessments, there were many people that put like fist to 5 or, you know, thumbs up, thumbs down, all of that you can still do in Zoom, and you can do it quickly. First of all, if you look at your reactions button, so if you go to the bottom is where it usually is, you can move it around, but there's a button called reactions, and you can do two things. You can do a thumbs up or you can do a clap. So feel free to just click on that and see what happens on your screen. So I see people's thumbs up coming up and that kind of thing. But those are the only two that are right there. But you could say, you know, even just, how do people feel about moving on? Put a thumbs up if you're good to go. You could do that. And in a classroom, if you're not sharing your screen, you could see, I think it's usually, the way I see it anyway, is 25 people on a screen. So you might be able to see everybody pretty quickly. When the screen's being shared, it limits your view of the participants. So that's one. There's also participants emojis. So if you click on participants, you should see at the bottom of that square, yes, no, go slower, go faster. And then there's a button for more where you could do thumbs up, thumbs down. You can raise your hand. And that's another way you can use as a teacher to ask for some feedback on different things. So like right now, I can see different people's reactions. And also like if on my more, I can see 5 people have a thumbs up, 5 people want a coffee break, that kind of thing. I can see different people's on each of their names, I can see things. So that's also a good way to get some feedback. That's a way you can use for people to ask you questions too. And even though as the host, I would have to have this window open to see everything. Also, if I was testing this with someone in a previous session, if somebody puts their hand up through that screen, it'll show up on my participants window. So it would probably catch your eye even if you're talking and you'd be like, oh, Joe has a question. So I can see his name show up there. You can do fist to 5. You can do that in the chat. So you could just say, use the chat like we did for the longer answer. But you could just say type 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in that chat just to let me know where you are right now in terms of your thinking on this, understanding this problem or whatnot. Same exact way you would use it in class, but you would have them type it in there so that you can take a quick glance and see where everybody is. Now on some of these, you have to do think through just like you do in class. Are the students comfortable putting their answer in there? Because everybody can see that chat, not just you. And then you can move students into their own breakout rooms at times. That can be a nice use of the breakout rooms. That could be more about formative assessment. So if you had 25 kids, you can set up 25 individual breakout rooms and say, I'm sending you in there for 3 minutes and I want everybody to start this problem and see how far you can get. Or I want everybody to write a topic sentence and then we're gonna have some volunteers share when you get back. Or whatever you would want it to be. But something where they could do their individual thinking or writing. If you had them do it in a Google Doc, which we'll talk about in a second, then you would also be able to maybe watch some of it being typed in and that kind of thing. But the individual breakout rooms can possibly be a good use for quick checks that you would use in class sometimes too, where you say, well, you have 5 minutes to write. So some other tools that we can mix in there is what I just said a little bit about is Google. So email, forms, docs, you can still use all of those. We're going to talk a little bit about Kahoot, Pear Deck. I noticed in the chat, several of you mentioned Quizlet Live, quizzes. You can still do those type of things in here as well. So in terms of Google, you can use documents for longer checks, just like you would in the classroom or writing, and then you're more assured that it's their individual writing because they just did it. You can use your forms and quizzes. And then, anything that you've done in classroom, you could still use. The pros of these things are the kids are typically used to these tools already. So you're not having to recreate and teach them about the tool. One of the downsides is, though, it sometimes can be clunky on their end to use it because they're in Zoom and they're trying to use one of these tools. So there might be a little bit of work to do with the technology of how do they split their screen, or you thinking through how they're going to be able to mute themselves and turn off their cameras for a little while potentially, so that then they can just go off and work in the Google work. A good place for these documents would be for exit slips, for helping you get a sense of how did today's lesson go and where is their understanding, and then to launch your next lesson. All right, Marshall's going to talk a little bit about some other digital tools that you could use. And I think while he's talking, think about the things you're already using that maybe we aren't mentioning, and you can transfer a lot of what we're saying to those tools.
Yeah, we know that a lot of you use Kahoot. It's a really popular formative assessment tool. And it's got some really great pros to it that we know. If you don't know Kahoot, it's basically kind of an interactive game show style of checking for understanding. Kids can play it individually, or you can put them in small groups and teams. And the positives of Kahoot is that it is widely used. Kids know it. Even if you yourself have never used it, chances are your students have used it in other classrooms. The competitive part of it makes it engaging and fun for them. And like I said, it can be done in groups, so that's adds to engagement a lot of times. And Kahoot does produce kind of a nice report. And yeah, you can see that on the screen now. It gives you kind of the breakdown of the individuals that you can view afterwards of how many kids got and which kids got each question that you asked right or wrong. One of the cons of Kahoot is that sometimes the fun can overtake the learning. It's sometimes so engaging, and kids are more concerned about answering fast and getting points than they are about actually paying attention to what they should be learning. So that's just in terms of expectations with Kahoot, really emphasizing to students that that's the most important thing, that they're learning from the experience and that you're getting good information about what they do and don't know, to make sure that they're focusing on that rather than just the fun of it is key. So in addition to Kahoot, Pear Deck is another really pretty widely used formative assessment tool. I don't think it's as popular as Kahoot. If you're not familiar with Pear Deck, it's basically an add-on to Google Slides that allows you to embed questions within a slide deck, and then students interact on their own screens with that question in the slide deck. So if you have some direct instruction you're going to do, and during the slide deck, you want to break up that instruction, you want to check how kids are grappling with the new content, you can embed Pear Deck slides. And I'm going to show you a couple examples. Here's one that's just kind of it's not a content related question, but you could ask kids, where would you like to go on vacation? And this type of Pear Deck slide would allow them to drag icons to different spots on the map, and you would get immediate info about how the kids were feeling about that question. The next slide, we'll look at another type of question that exists in Pear Deck. For the math teachers, maybe the science teachers as well in the room, maybe some CTE teachers, this could also be useful. They have graph template questions where you could ask kids to draw on a graph in the middle of your slide deck presentation and get immediate sense of how kids are understanding. With a slide like this, each individual kid would draw their own, would graph a line based on an equation, for example. They would submit it, and you could then look at each of their individual answers as well as the collection of answers. Another type is kind of a big picture, more wide open question, like a why question. So these would be more discussion based or more asking kids to elaborate on their thinking. And again, kids would be able to type on their individual screen, and then you as a teacher get to see their answers. Now, when it comes to Kahoot and Pear Deck, yeah, we can go ahead to the next slide. When it comes to both Kahoot and Pear Deck, before we give you a chance to chat with your colleagues, just one big challenge for both of those tools in this space that you'll have to be kind of thoughtful about if you want to use them, and if you do use them, is the juggling of screens for kids. So for both of those tools, you would have something projected on the screen in class, and then kids would be working on their own screens at their tables. Now, of course, in the e-learning environment, the projected screen that you're using is on their device. And so part of the challenge is helping kids to see what you want them to see from your presentation, while also being able to interact either in another tab or on another screen. So you might have to find out from kids what their ability is to do that, and give them some scaffolded support for that tech piece if you want to use Kahoot or Pear Deck in the synchronous space.
So Marshall, before we jump into the breakout, I wanted to check in. Matt Berkey, are you still there? There were lots of questions in the chat, and I just wanted to make sure, check in with Matt about if everything got answered and if there's anything good for make sure the whole group knows about.
One of the questions that was how to make sure that you're seeing all of the student responses and not just going back later and seeing individual student responses. And that would be through what's called the teacher dashboard. So you would log in separately and go to you'd be running the student version, but then you could log in on another tab or another machine, or if like you had your iPad or phone, and you could look at the teacher dashboard while it's happening, and you could see everything that all the students are doing concurrently. So that's a useful tool.
Great, thank you. And I see in the chat, people are mentioning all sorts of tools that we don't have listed here, and absolutely. Jamboard is a great tool, quizzes, and probably anything that you've already used in class, you can use in this environment as well. So what we're going to have you do is we're going to go into breakout rooms and talk about this question: is what formative assessments would you like to incorporate into your synchronous sessions this fall? That's one question. Another option would be to talk a little bit about what you're feeling anxious about in terms of formative assessment in the fall, and maybe the people in your group can help you think through how and where you could use what you want to be using during those sessions. So Matt, if you could make the groups 4 to 5 people, and then let's go for 12 minutes, if you could set the timer, and just give people a chunk of time to think through how you would use formative assessments in your synchronous sessions.